Greetings, Otaku Faithful. Thank you for joining me again this week. Once again, it's Larry Williams, OAW Commander-in-Chief, and I'm here to bring you all yet again another Vikings episode review right here on Otaku Assemble Weekly. And as always, here to bring you the latest in this week's Vikings episode review. And this is my review of Season 4, Episode 9, entitled Death All Around. Now, general thoughts on this week's episode. I actually don't have too many thoughts about this week's episode, mainly because this was another episode I felt was more of half an episode rather than a full-blown episode. And what I mean by that is the scenes we got that actually progressed the overall narrative, the overall plot for this season were very minimal. And I felt like there were a lot of scenes that were plotted into this episode just to give us filler. So for an example, the events that took place in Kattegat this week. Granted, we did have a minor character death with what I believe is Bjorn's daughter, Siggy, that was found dead in Kattegat. Now, that can play a larger role later on in the season, but as it stands right now, it's sort of a minimal thing. So that those scenes, and then also the scenes with Aethelwulf when they finally arrive in Rome. Great scenes, really cool, really well done, really well shot at scenes, certainly, but once again, sort of filler. So that's why I kind of view this more as, okay, like, if we take the important elements of this episode, they really could have been done in less than 30 minutes. So that's why I felt like it was more of half an episode than a full-blown episode. So a little bit more filler than substance in this week's episode, if you will. But there are a few things I do want to talk about from this week's episode, but I want to talk about them more so as how they could potentially create some conflicts, or how they can potentially add on to the conflicts that have already been set up to later on in this season. So what am I talking about? Okay, for an example, let's take what happened in Wessex this week. We only got one scene, and it was Ecbert's official coronation as both King of Wessex and of Mercia. And I was kind of surprised that we only got that one scene and how brief it actually was. But if you all will recall from my previous review, King Aelle is in this episode again, and pretty much the wedge between him and Ecbert has now been solidified, because Aelle displayed, you know, the fact that, hey, you did betray me. We were supposed to take over Mercia, split it up evenly amongst ourselves, but you took it for yourself, you know, whole. And what this established, especially with Ecbert's response, where he pretty much told Aelle, hey, that was when we were considered equals. Now, my kingdom is vaster than yours. It's richer than yours. I have more men than you do. So we are no longer equals. And this is just something you're going to have to get used to. So, like I said, that plays into what was previously set up as a potential conflict for us, because we always knew that Ecbert wanted Mercia for himself. So now these two kings and their discussion, just solidifies that now they're going to be at odds with each other. They are no longer allies, now they are enemies, and so that opens the door for potential conflicts later on in the season. Another setup, another thing which could have very easily been disregarded as more filler, but I felt like it actually could contribute to something later on, and that's what happened over in Paris, where Roland, who was pretty much Count Odo's number 2, he gets promoted to defender of the city, and now he's sort of right under the emperor's thumb. And of course, we found out later in the episode that he's actually having an affair with the emperor. Now that, yeah, you can just go ahead and write that off as pandering, but I think it's important, especially when you take in consideration the scene we got in between where Rollo was talking to the princess, and she pointed out that it was not common, and that she thought it was odd for someone like Roland, who comes from common beginnings, to ascend to a position like that and to be so closely affiliated with the emperor. She viewed it as a potential threat to Rollo, because she felt as if Rollo was sort of passed over, despite the fact that, as Rollo pointed out, he is a duke, he was given many lands, and he is responsible for defending the entire kingdom. But she points out that sort of position being that close to her father, she doesn't feel comfortable about that. Now, the reason why I wanted to bring that up in this review is because I think that it could potentially lead to a conflict directly between Rollo and Roland. Why? Because let's face it, even though the princess did point out how much of a threat Count Odo was to Rollo, he didn't have to deal with that directly. He didn't have to deal with that on his own. That sort of happened without any sort of interference with him. But now we have this guy who is ambitious, who did throw Odo under the bus so that he can claim that position. Now this might be the guy that Rollo actually does have to get his hands dirty with. So it'll be interesting to see how that whole thing plays out, because now they pretty much are bidding for that number 2 spot right underneath the Emperor. So we'll see how that whole thing plays out. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about is what potential conflict could come with the Vikings. Now, in this week's episode, we did see that Ragnar's plan actually did work, that they were able to successfully transport the ships between, over the mountains to end up upriver. So, and now Paris is within sight. So, and based off of the preview we got for next week's episode, yes, they are. Now we're going to get the full-blown, second attack on Paris, if you will. But the thing I wanted to point out, very subtly done, but if you pay attention to it, okay, so the major thing that happened with the Vikings is that Elendor was taken out in this week's episode. Him trying to get Torvi to assassinate Bjorn, which now we finally have figured out what her role in this was supposed to be. It's just not that she's a middleman, but that he was going to use her to carry out the hit. Well, okay, so Elendor's done. That's done. Bjorn saved. Okay, we don't have to worry about that anymore. But what I want to point out is the fact that, remember, Harold and his brother, remember that they are still very much in the Viking party. They are still very much ruthless. They are still very much hungry, as we saw with them completely slaughtering this Frankish family. But where the threat comes into play, because they do still pose a very big threat. Why? Because Ragnar's party is now weakened. Ragnar is going through withdrawals because he's saving that last piece of medicine that he has for the fight with Rollo, right? But that is putting him in a weakened state, as Bjorn pointed out. Also, Lagertha had a miscarriage in this episode, so even if she does regain somewhat of her strength by the time next week's episode happens, she is still in not only a physically vulnerable state, but an emotionally vulnerable state. So the only person that is really on their game in terms of Ragnar's main party is Bjorn. On the other hand, you have Harold, you have his brother, both of which I think would fully be able to take care. They would be able to completely even the odds between a weakened Ragnar, a weakened Lagertha, and a full-strength Bjorn. So who's the third party that could actually be a deciding factor in that feud? That would be Loki. And that's where Loki's story would sort of come back into play, because he does have the potential to sway that conflict in any one direction. So I thought that this episode, once again, sort of planting the seeds for what we could potentially see later on, subtly done, but we can't just ignore that. We can't ignore what happened with Ragnar and Lagertha, because it is putting them in a weakened position, and it's making them easier targets. That pretty much wraps up my Vikings episode review. I want to thank you all for joining me again this week, and in the comments below, leave your thoughts on this week's episode, as well as what do you all expect to see with the mid-season finale kicking off next week. Please feel free, leave those thoughts in the comments below. If you like this video, please thumb it up, share it with other fans of the show and people you think would enjoy my review. And if you have yet to do so, subscribe to the OAW YouTube channel. Annotation is above head. So what's coming down the wire as we kick off this new week? Once again, I do want to apologize for the delay with this review. I am currently nursing a toothache that has actually made it difficult for me to speak, which is why my voice might actually sound a little bit different in this review. So I had to take a couple of days off, and I'm still dealing with it. But But what you guys will be seeing, so tomorrow morning, actually, you all will be getting my first impression / episode 1 review of Hunter x Hunter. That will be up on the OAW YouTube channel tomorrow morning. Tomorrow night, you will be getting the discussion of the week. And I'm actually going to go ahead and wait till Wednesday to post up the latest top 5 video segment. So with that being said, this has been Larry Williams, OAW Commander-in-Chief. I'm signing off, and until next time, peace.